long time since I've been here.
Where were you?
Getting drunk?
Where?
I'm still the people's choice. I did not make a public display of myself anywhere.
You realize, of course, that you will one day, inevitably.
Inevitably.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Adam Bench and Charlotte Langley, who are the CEO and Chief Culinary Officer of Scout Canning, respectively. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So, Adam, you have traversed tech startups and food throughout your career, and I'm curious as to know why is the intersection of food and technology so important to you?
I think it kind of came as a result of recognizing everybody was so disconnected from food systems and the commercialization, industrialization of food and how that was infecting our environment. And then, with the explosion of kind of food culture, hospitalities and chefs, consumers start to pay a lot more attention to where their food comes from and to engage a lot more on the topic. So, technology solves problems. So building products and services through tech that helped address food systems issues was, a big passion of mine, and connecting back to, I guess, my activism as an environmentalist.
That's great. Thank you for that, Adam. Appreciate it. And going to you, Charlotte, you have been at famed restaurants such as Whale's Bone and Sea Restaurant. What was that experience like when you were behind the kitchen? And how has your journey led you to Scout Canning?
Wonderful question. The experience of working in a kitchen, in a professional style kitchen, as in like the theme of fine dining when I started cooking was very popular, was a very engaging and quick learning space. So you really had to think on your feet. You had to pivot quickly. You had to solve problems quickly. And that was a space that I really enjoyed, sort of learning how to solve problems. You have a small group of people and something comes out improperly, or a medium rare fish is served medium by accident. You need to really solve those problems and learn a lot about communicating, especially with your team as well as the guests. The beginning of Scout, or the ideation of Scout, really came about. I wanted to sort of share the art and culture of preserving fish in North America, and it was something that I thought was sort of missing in this scene. For example, North American culture around canned seafood specifically is more akin to commodity and commercialization, like Adam mentioned. And for me, it's about a better understanding of the art and culture of it, the techniques, the finesse, the history and the heritage of canned seafood specifically. And it just sort of came naturally over a period of time. I often call it a happy accident.
Great. Thank you very much for that. And it's interesting, the way you describe your experience in restaurants actually sounds very similar to how startups are. So I want to ask both of you in terms of what is Scout Canning and where in the value chain are you guys operating in?
Adam, why don't we choose one?
Yeah. So, we have, commercial cannery partners that we've teamed up with to help scale our production. And when you look at the North American marketplace, there are really no more there isn't a lot of domestic production, and there's not a lot of high quality domestic brands in the canned seafood space. Globally, it's a very big industry, growing from 32 to 38 billion by 2025. There's a couple of different market conditions that are providing all of the growth in the category. But there's a missing piece of a higher quality product in the North American market, and that's kind of the white space that we identified was, being able to offer a canned seafood product that was an upgrade from commodity brands like Bumblebee, Wild Planet, Chicken of the Sea, but equal in quality and more affordable than really fancy European imported conserva brands that are coming from, markets like Spain, Portugal, and France. A few years ago in 2018, a lot of chefs, wine bars, and the hospitality industry started to import a lot of the higher quality European brands, and there wasn't a domestic equivalent. So through Charlotte's work and in the hospitality industry and as a chef, found that intersection of, a missing brand in the canned seafood category, filling the white space between the European imports and then the lower quality and imported domestic brands.
So as I'm listening, one of the things that I love this kind of story is that, there's this kind of a white space, and it's so clear in terms of this big gap between the domestic commoditized products versus the foreign imports. And you guys are essentially tackling this premium market. And of course, that premium also connotates or correlated with people that are, environmentally conscious, sustainability oriented as well. So they're willing to pay for that premium experience. Again, if you could talk a little bit about your particular IP. And so the sourcing, you guys are sourcing through sustainable fisheries and fishermen. And then you said that you guys are also you guys are outsourcing the contract manufacturing aspects of it. So I'm just trying to understand, where's the IP specific to your brand?
Sure.
100%. Sorry, Adam. We're both enthusiastic about the topic, that's for sure. I'll start, and Adam, if you can fill in any gaps if I miss anything. When it comes down to going back into the sourcing, as well as the fishery partners and the commercialization partners, as in people that are producing Scout specifically, it really comes down to the sourcing, the relationships in our internal community. And community is one of our brand pillars in Scout. And that really comes back to understanding the source of the fish, the source of the species, the partnerships with these fishers, our certification standards that we follow, and the guidelines that really truly dictate how we're sourcing. We have certain criteria around making it our own, which is starting with the source of the species and the partnership. All of our wild species, are MSC certified, and our aquaculture species, we work very diligently to find the accurate sources for those. And then when it comes to the actual recipes or the secret ingredients, it comes down to modifying or working on some really interesting recipes and ingredients. So for example, flavor profiles that I've always loved for a very long time, I was able to translate into the final canned product, into a North American conserva, if you wish, and then carrying that into the facilities that are producing Scout. What makes it ours is the sourcing, the relationships, and how we communicate with our community.
And generally, when you look at the bigger players in the space that have been around for 50 plus years, these are, big multinational private equity owned brands that are North American brands, but, foreign owned and imported seafood, and underpinning like local sourcing is huge, because none of the national brands that most consumers are familiar with, are offering any product at a local level. So while our impact program, a bigger brand, established brand could replicate, while they could switch to local sourcing, they won't, because of the structure and the size of them as corporations. So we're able to come into the market into an industry that has a really high barrier to entry. And there's a reason why there aren't a lot of emerging seafood brands and consumer packaged goods, because it is complex from a regulatory point of view. It's very fragmented from a sourcing point of view, and it's resource heavy and very capital intensive at the beginning. And there's some uniquenesses there. That don't exist in other, CPG categories or food businesses to scale up. So the impact program and the local sourcing and the magic touch of what we've created with the brand, and the fact that it started authentically with Charlotte, is just something that, the bigger brands in the category can't replicate. Consumers haven't had an upgrade option for a long time.
Well, it's interesting because, in many ways, it's kind of the legacy lingering from the first industrial revolution, where 50s and 60s, whoever grew up kind of during that period all the way to now, we kind of grew up in these canned foods. And so we've institutionalized it, whether we know it or not. Now, you mentioned something that's quite interesting, Adam, is that the fishing industry is highly complex, highly regulated. There's certain quotas, there are certain periods when you can fish, when you can't fish. How does that play into local sourcing as well as the biodiversity, and then also your capacity? Because I recognize you guys are in a niche market, but in terms of meeting the shelf capacity for larger distribution chains, how will that eventually work out?
Mm-hmm. So with wild caught, we're following the MSC standards. So, we're constrained to, geographically right now, Canada and the US, so where we source our seafood. and then it has to be MSC certified. So then we drill down even deeper and have more limitations to what we can bring to market. So it kind of starts there. What's a regional species that we can work to be attractive and appetizing to a consumer in Middle America, right? Like, how can we make something that might be a bit more unique and specialized have broad appeal? One of the reasons that you saw us start with more unique species like trout, lobster, mussels, and not tuna and salmon is because that's not the direction of the brand. And we see so much opportunity to encourage biodiversity in seafood consumption. But in order to do that, you kind of have to meet consumers where they're at a little bit, which is why we offered them tuna. And it's a really great way to introduce them to our brand, but as a way also to guide them towards more biodiverse species that are more responsible. So if we can, bring consumers along a journey and offer them really delicious seafood products under the trust of the Scout brand, they're more inclined to try new species, which then give some of the overfish to break, right? We have huge issues globally, and in particular in North America, with the salmon stocks dwindling and are suffering because of the monoculture that now exists and the salmon production that we put into open net pens that's now affecting wild populations because of this monoculture consumer appetite and demand for the same species on repeat. Tuna and salmon, like we all grew up with, is what is the most consumed. They're two of the most consumed species apart from shrimp in the Canadian and US market. And we need a solution to that. But the solution is not just stop eating seafood. It's actually to encourage biodiversity. Land-based agriculture, you have chicken, beef, and pork. We also grew up with that. You're very rarely eating goat or buffalo. And we have such diversity in seafood that we've barely scratched the surface of. And a big part of that is because consumers are intimidated. It's hard to know how to cook 50 types of fish. As a home cook, especially if you're not really into food. So we're trying to kind of take away the gap there of the skills gap or the intimidation factor around preparing new types of seafood by demonstrating that there's lots of delicious species that exist in the ocean. And by eating more seafood and different types of seafood, you can actually help protect the ecosystem.
So Charlotte, Adam brings up a really great point, is that there's a growing trend among chefs to introduce different species of fish, as an example. Mm-hmm. And what's cool about that is not just the biodiversity aspect, but the economics also changes as well from the microeconomics of an entree. Can you talk about how that is meeting with the demand side? In other words, there's a certain palate and preference that's been developed over generations in America. So how do you meet kind of that middle ground, and can you talk about the profiles of some of the recipes that you guys are creating that matches and starts to kind of bridge some of those gaps?
100%. I think it comes down to, a lot of time, it comes down to trust. And when you're working with specifically, let's say you're in a restaurant anywhere in North America, and you get to know the chef, or you become a regular, and you've been ordering the same dish, every Friday you go and you eat your same dish because you absolutely love it. The chef is very likely, once they get to know you, going to offer an alternative suggestion, in the sense where, like, I recognize that you love this, but let's try some other things. And it comes down to really building the relationship in the community with your clients and the consumer in general, to allow them to trust you, to lead them on a new journey, to discover other species in this category. And I feel that when it comes to sort of creating these recipes, the internal cogs and wheels of Scout products, there are recognizable flavor profiles that you can kind of lean into and go, okay, I recognize, like, trout's salmon with dill. Okay, people love salmon with dill. They put a bit of lemon on it. That's a very North American standard. If we say, okay, let's try a different species, we're going to use trout. It's actually in the same family. It's a salmonid species, only trout never get to see the ocean, unfortunately. They can maybe try a little bit of a different species and go, okay, this is similar. I recognize it. I enjoy it. But also it allows chefs to sort of look at their bottom line, because, as you know, hospitality industry, the margins are razor thin, as well as the seafood canning industry. And we're trying to find ways to say, okay, how do we maximize on an alternative species? Let's say it's mussels. Mussels are high protein shellfish. They're absolutely delicious. They have a wonderful shelf life, and they're very diverse. You can do so many different things with mussels. Maybe you didn't experience that for a period of time in your life, but I'm going to say, now that you know Scout and you're working with myself and me, it's cost effective, it's delicious, and it's a little bit different, but not too scary. So comes back down to trust.
So both of you have been using the term trust consistently, and there's a kind of a narrative that's building around that, which brings me to my next question, which is, what is seafood fraud?
Yeah. Amazing question. Well, there's many And in the chain of custody and the line from how the fish is caught, where it is caught to when it lands on your plate or in your local grocery store, there are a lot of places where it can be mislabeled or a lot of fraud can be introduced. It can be, for example, you mentioned some people really prefer specific species. They really love rockfish. Okay, that's a great example. Rockfish is a small bass-like species that has a lot of other species that kind of look like it. Also has a similar flesh texture and flavor. It's very mild, large flake. It's very easy for someone to say, this is a rockfish fillet. I'm putting this in parentheses, but it's something else. It's coming from a different place. That's just one example of where mislabeling and fraud can happen. It can also come down to packaging, where people are putting on their own certification stamps, which are not actually global or nationally recognized certification standards. They make like a, use an example. They make up their own internally because they are a reputable company and they put their own stamp and brand on it. That's one place. And also comes down to weight and volumes. I like to look at the world of chicken, for example. They plump out the chicken breast with a specific amount of, moisture, vitamins to make it look more pleasing and a larger portion. The same thing can happen in the seafood world. So those are three spaces where fraud can happen. Adam, if you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely at a species level. I mean, the more hands the product exchanges, the more likely there is to be fraud, unless the brand of the company is participating in a certification scheme like the Marine Stewardship Council Chain of Custody program. Mm-hmm. And outside of that, referencing the trust comment, I mean, there is broken trust with consumers. There's the intimidation factor. So the trust factor of going to chefs to cook seafood is something that we've kind of replicated as a brand. Having a chef behind the brand, being more ingredient forward and bringing in transparent conversations around our sourcing help create that trust and credibility where it is broken in other parts of the seafood industry. When you just peek under the hood, especially in canning, I mean, globally, the global fishing industry is rampant with human rights abuses and child labor, forced labor, modern slavery, particularly in the global tuna trade. That $2 can of tuna that ends up on a shelf at Walmart, there's a reason why it's $2. It's a fake cost, not the true cost of that product. It's the way that it's been sourced at the detriment to the environment and of humans. So there's that part of the industry that's really quite broken, and we are hoping to encourage consumers more to question the lower dollar value products, where they're coming from, how that cost is so low. And then when you look at it from a corporate level, take a look at the big brands in the commodity space in North America over the last few years. I mean, one of the CEOs in jail, they're price fixing together, kind of working behind the scenes against retailers. And it just shows you the level of business ethics that exists in the category. They became such big ballooned companies that there is no longer a sight line to the end consumer. It's about bottom line, no real regard for the environment and for people. It's changing. Brands like Scout are now a forcing function for those bigger brands to start paying attention as we take market share away from them. And that's great. That means that we're doing our job properly.
Again, there's a lot of parallelism to things like agriculture as well as poultry and meat industry, where you're essentially working through not just collectives, but large, big corporations. So in the sector that you're in, I guess a couple of questions is around, lobbying, right? So there's a huge, powerful machinery that's backed by these large corporate bodies that are trying to push for their incentives. So how is that working potentially against you? And then what are some other potential barriers that you have to, as a small organization, start to have to tackle that maybe others don't have to because they've been around for so long?
Sure. I'll answer the first part. I mean, at a policy level, there's so much opportunity. And I think, there's a lot happening in the US in aquaculture right now. Aquaculture is a hot topic on the investment front. We see many funds like S2G's $250 million Oceans Fund that got released this year, along with 2 or 3 new funds coming out of Europe to invest in aquaculture, like AquaSpark. So there's a lot of private capital now entering the space. And a lot of that private capital is also attached to some pretty smart investors that are impact driven. So I think the aquaculture policy and wild seafood sourcing policies that are coming into play now have more smart capital behind them, and it's less driven by industry bottom line, but by folks who are coming in looking for a return and also to make an impact. And that's just going to provide better policy opportunities as more smart capital shows up at the table to have these conversations. So There's small, scrappy brands like Scout that absolutely still have a voice. Our government's pretty accessible in Canada, and we definitely have conversations with the Department of Fisheries and, you know, different First Nations partners that we're working to bring into our conversations to help have more of a voice. And I referenced how fragmented the seafood industry is. It is by species, different quotas, different communities have different types of vessels. I mean, it's pretty fragmented, but a brand like Scout can actually be quite the connector of many different voices, almost like an association, and then bring those collective voices to the table to help with policy. Some interesting things happening in Canada. The government federally has mandated the removal of open net pens in certain parts of the Howe Sound out here in British Columbia to reduce, the open net pen salmon aquaculture industry and to move it on land. That transition is going to be expensive, but in the long run, it's to everybody's benefit. Just the way it's done is very political. Who are we cutting off right now? Who's going to be hurt by that in the short term, and where are the long-term benefits that come, and how can we protect people in the process? Larger companies have more capital available and bigger legal teams and can get more done at a policy level. But we're living in an era now where people are looking behind the hood more, and I think some of those outdated policies that have been around for a while are starting to get shooken up as there's more new young blood coming into the fishing industry. Kids are taking over their parents' businesses in the fishing industry, or bringing a different view and approach to it. So I think that while traditionally maybe a smaller brand wouldn't have had as much influence over policy, I think there's a lot of pieces out there that are moving in the right direction for us to have more of a voice. I
agree with that. And I think there's a general movement towards triple bottom line on the investment side. So I think timing wise, it really is quite amazing. I want to go back to you, Charlotte, in terms of your perspective, if you could opine a little bit around farm fish and your thoughts about that.
100%. When it comes down to farm species in general, we utilize 2 farm species currently in our lineup, and one of them is mussels, and it's farmed in the ocean. And I have to say, aquaculture and farm species is a very delicate subject, because with any farmed animal or creature, there's different varieties of how you're farming: conventional, organic, non-conventional. There's many ways, right? So when it comes down to understanding or deepening your understanding around aquaculture, I would say to start maybe in the world of the bivalve and the shellfish category. If we're looking at the larger scale fin species, there is a lot of discrepancy in that category, and we do rely heavily on that market to feed people. That's what it is. So in regards to our sourcing and our understanding of farm aquaculture and how we utilize it in our own company in Scout, is we started with some bivalves. We looked at trout and we go, how does this apply to us right now? One of our missions is to protect our oceans and waterways. So how do we do that? By eliminating feed and byproduct feed of farm species into our own products. So by using alternative feeds that still provide great protein, that provide those carotenoids to give the natural flavors and colors to the trout species, we are working to eliminate the pull from the wild ocean to feed these farm species. It's a really, we could probably have a huge conversation just around this specifically, hours and hours. So I'm going to leave it at that we focus really on the sourcing, the relationship, and the feed that the aquaculture species that we work with actually survives and thrives on.
So I think we're almost out of time here. One of my last questions I have is regarding, some believe that perhaps maybe we should just leave nature alone. And I think there's been certain parts of the oceans where perhaps maybe it was depleted of certain biodiversity, but left alone for a few years, it starts to thrive again. So in that regard, what are your thoughts about cell-based aqua products? So essentially lab-grown tuna or salmon or other types of species.
That's a very interesting question. It's funny, I just started actually engaging in an algae-based supplement that I'm taking at home that isn't a fin flesh species, but it's an algae production, which, as you guys know, algae is also a very interesting topic to get into, that produces biofuel and all these great things. And I am a little bit, I'm excited about the possibility of working with very unique, maybe support systems, be around feed for these fish. Maybe it's, crickets, blood meal, those sort of things, versus actually growing species this way. But Adam, I'll let you take this one over, because this is a little bit of a
No
Interesting
worries.
topic. I'm like, I like algae, but I'm not sure if I want to grow tuna in a petri dish at this point, to be honest.
There is equal opportunity in plant-based seafood products, just like we've seen the explosion in plant-based everything else, chicken, beef, and pork replacements and other, kind of like replications of meat. Brands like Beyond Meat and Memphis Meats have done a ton of great work in terms of bringing consumers into the environmental conversation, understanding the benefits of reducing our consumption of land-based animal meat or land-based proteins. And I think that that's also important to have in seafood. So I think it's important to have these companies that are providing some products that offer some environmental solutions. But I think the more important thing is that it's bringing consumers into the actual problem. My only caveat with that statement is that we cannot just skip over protecting our oceans and waterways to start growing tuna in a petri dish. Biodiversity is very important. We're now moving into solutions to make things like tuna and salmon in a petri dish to feed that like insatiable demand that the world has for these two species, where we actually should be designing our way towards a future where we are encouraging biodiversity by offering them real, unprocessed, wild harvested fish or responsibly raised aquaculture products, which is all available. The technology is available to us. So yeah, the petri dish thing, I've got a lot to say about that, but I'll leave it there.
I'm going to leave the final comment for Charlotte in terms of any final comment before we wrap it up here for today.
Well, I'd have to say, if for your broader audience, anyone who's looking or has interest in deepening their knowledge around the specific wild species or aquaculture species, there's some great resources out there. MSC.org is one, ASC.org, and then always check out Scout, enjoyscout.com.
Terrific. So with that, I've been joined by Adam Bent and Charlotte Langley of Scout Canning. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks, Scott.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.